There comes a strange moment in many lives, especially among seekers-thinkers and those driven by inner truth, when what once moved you no longer does. The goals that used to fill your days now seem hollow. The to-do lists are crossed off not with pride, but indifference. The world appears unchanged, and yet something deep within you is undeniably different. You see through the illusion, but you don't yet know how to live with what you've seen. And in that space, motivation disappears like mist under morning sun. This is not failure. It is not weakness. It is what I have come to call the sacred pause, a transitional stage that Carl Jung, the father of analytical psychology, understood with profound clarity. He did not name it using modern spiritual jargon, but he recognized its essence, the period when the unconscious becomes conscious and the old self begins to die not violently, but quietly. Spiritual awakening is often depicted as a moment of radiant clarity, a sudden opening of the heart, an illumination of the soul, a blissful release from illusion. And indeed, for a fleeting time, it can feel that way. The veil lifts, the masks fall, the truth stands naked before you. But what happens next is rarely discussed. What follows that dazzling clarity is not always more light, it is often shadow, silence, stillness, the kind that unnerves rather than soothes, a kind of death not of the body, but of identity. And in that aftermath, motivation dissolves. This is not a mistake, nor is it a malfunction. It is, as Carl Jung might say, the beginning of psychic reorientation, a recalibration of the self's inner compass once the ego has been stripped of its illusions. Most people do not awaken because they are comfortable. They awaken because they must. A collapse, a loss, a disillusionment cracks the surface of the everyday self. The unconscious, long ignored, spills into awareness. Suddenly, what once made sense no longer does. You begin to see the persona, the social mask, as just that, a construct designed to survive, not to fulfill. And this recognition is as liberating as it is destabilizing. Jung referred to this moment as the confrontation with the shadow, the repressed, denied, and unintegrated parts of the psyche. When the ego awakens, it does not simply ascend. It must first descend. It must turn inward and face what it has spent a lifetime avoiding. And this turning inward is often mistaken for stagnation. But it is in truth the first act of true psychological maturity. Consider how your motivation operated before awakening. It was driven by adaptation, by the need to belong, to succeed, to earn approval. These are not inherently negative aims. In fact, Jung acknowledged that the formation of the ego is an essential stage of human development. But once awakening occurs, the old motivations lose their grip. You no longer feel the urge to compete, to prove, to perform. The rewards of the outer world seem like echoes from another life. And so you stop, not from laziness, but from clarity. Here lies the paradox. The clearer your inner vision becomes, the harder it is to engage with systems built on falsehood. The job that once gave you status now feels soulless. The relationships you clung to now feel performative. Even your ambitions, crafted from years of striving, no longer ignite the fire within. You are not tired because you've done too much. You are tired because the fuel no longer works. Jung described this stage as a psychic death. The ego, having lost its scaffolding, collapses into a kind of liminal space, a psychological cocoon. You are no longer who you were, and not yet who you are becoming. This is the wilderness, the sacred in-between. And it is here in this uncertain terrain that the true work begins. Many in our modern world misdiagnose this experience. They call it depression, apathy, laziness. But Jung saw deeper. He knew that what appears as dysfunction may in fact be transformation. The psyche has its own intelligence. It knows that to build something new, the old must first fall away. So, it halts. It resists your attempts to get back to normal. And rightly so, for normal was never your truth. It was your adaptation. This is why you may feel like a stranger to your own life. The ego, confused and bereft of direction, grasps for anything familiar. But the self, the deeper, wiser center within, remains still. It does not rush. It waits. It observes. It begins to reorganize you from the inside out. Jung called this process individuation, the journey from a fragmented self to a whole one. But individuation cannot begin until the ego admits it does not have all the answers. And this surrender, this release of control, is what opens the door to true transformation. So if you find yourself staring at the ceiling unmoved by your old dreams, if you feel unmotivated, detached, even hollow, know that you are not broken. You are being restructured. You are being prepared for a life of depth, not just survival. The energy that once drove you to impress, to hustle, to achieve, is being withdrawn not as punishment, but as protection. The self is calling your energy back, conserving it for something more essential. In Jungian terms, this is the beginning of the return to the self, a painful, confusing, and often silent beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. And as we'll explore next, this psychological void is not empty, it is fertile. It is the soil from which new life may rise, if you have the patience to wait and the courage to listen. When the ego dissolves after awakening, a curious stillness sets in. You are no longer driven by the identity you once fought so hard to maintain, yet you have not yet become the person your deeper nature is trying to reveal. This in-between state, this strange suspension of will, is what Carl Jung would call a necessary psychological interval, a sacred pause. And though our culture of productivity urges you to push through it, this phase cannot be rushed. In our fast-paced world, stillness is often mistaken for stagnation. But psychologically, the absence of movement can be one of the most powerful moments in human development. It is during this pause that the unconscious has space to rise. Without constant distractions or egoic striving, the deeper aspects of the self, the forgotten, the repressed, the symbolic, begin to stir. Jung saw this period not as an affliction, but as a rite of passage. It is the descent into what mythologists and depth psychologists call the underworld. This is where the archetypal hero retreats not to conquer, but to confront. It is here in the quiet inner cave that the soul negotiates a new relationship with meaning. For many, this pause arrives without warning. One day, you are chasing goals, the next, you're unable to care whether those goals ever mattered. You look at the world, and rather than feeling inspired, you feel empty. This is not disinterest, it is disidentification. You are slowly peeling away the false layers of self that were built from other people's expectations, societal conditioning, and inherited fears. This process is deeply disorienting. As Jung wrote, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. To become conscious is to sacrifice comfort and often identity. The old motivation, the one that ran on ambition, approval, and adrenaline, no longer fits. And what replaces it doesn't arrive immediately. This is where the psychological risk emerges. Many become trapped here, mislabeling their pause as failure, depression, or inadequacy. But to judge the sacred pause is to misunderstand its purpose. The psyche knows something the ego does not, that creation cannot emerge from exhaustion. The soul cannot be summoned by force. It speaks in silence, in symbols, in slow awakenings. When you feel disconnected after spiritual awakening, it is not because something has gone wrong. It is because something deeper is asking to be born, and it cannot share space with the noise of your former life. This void, uncomfortable, barren quiet is what ancient traditions called the wilderness. The Hebrews wandered it. The Buddha sat in it. Christ was tempted within it. And every mythic hero before returning with wisdom endured it. In Jungian terms, this phase represents the withdrawal of projection, a moment when we stop seeking salvation in the world and turn inward, realizing that the answers we crave must come from within. It is at this point that we meet the self not as an idea, but as a presence, not as a concept, but as a whisper. Yet we resist. We've been trained to equate movement with progress. To pause feels like regression. But Jung would argue otherwise. The withdrawal of motivation is not regression. It is the redirection of psychic energy. In analytical psychology, this energy is called libido, not merely sexual, but the broader life force that animates desire, interest, and creativity. After awakening, this libido is pulled away from the outer world and redirected inward toward healing, integration, and rebirth. The key is not to pathologize this phase. Instead, witness it. Observe it without panic. This is the moment where individuation begins. Individuation is not self-improvement, it is self-revelation. It is the unfolding of your inner truth step by step as your unconscious contents are slowly made conscious. During this time, symbols begin to emerge, perhaps in your dreams, perhaps in your thoughts. You may notice synchronicities or archetypal patterns. These are not accidents. Jung believed the unconscious communicates in images and patterns. The sacred pause is the stage on which these symbolic communications first appear. You are being invited into a deeper dialogue, not with the world, but with your soul. And that's why the loss of motivation is so essential. If you were still busy chasing, performing, striving, you'd miss the quiet signals. The self doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It waits. And once the ego has exhausted itself, the self begins to speak. So if you find yourself in this void, confused, restless, unmotivated, take heart. You are not broken. You are not lazy. You are in the cocoon. You are between forms. You have disidentified from the persona, but have not yet stabilized in the self. This is where the world often loses us. It offers no roadmap for stillness. But Jung did. He reminded us that transformation always begins in darkness, not in light. So honor this space, honor this phase. For what is silent now may soon become the source of your deepest strength. In Part 3, we will explore how to navigate the temptations of avoidance and spiritual bypassing that can arise in this void, and how to remain grounded in the face of discomfort without abandoning the journey. In the silence that follows awakening, when the world feels distant and the ego has loosened its grip, a subtle danger begins to emerge. It is not the darkness that threatens you now, it is the illusion of premature light. Carl Jung warned that when individuals encounter the vastness of the unconscious, the ego, rather than surrender, often seeks refuge. And sometimes that refuge takes the form of spiritual ideals. This is what we now call spiritual bypassing. At its core, spiritual bypassing is the misuse of spiritual concepts to avoid the difficult psychological work of shadow integration. It is not true transcendence. It is a kind of self-deception. One convinces themselves that nothing matters, that everything is an illusion, and therefore there is no need to feel, no need to grieve, no need to confront the broken pieces within. But Jung would argue that what you avoid does not disappear. It simply retreats into the unconscious, where it grows stronger. And if left unintegrated, it returns not as wisdom, but as neurosis. He wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." In this phase of awakening, it is tempting to leap into abstract truths as a way to escape the rawness of becoming. This confusion is most visible in the way detachment is misunderstood. True psychological detachment is born of clarity and inner wholeness. It does not reject life, it embraces it without possession. But many interpret detachment as disengagement, a kind of numb resignation dressed up in the language of enlightenment. They stop caring, not because they have transcended desire, but because they are afraid to feel the grief of what is being lost. This fear is natural. When your old identity dissolves, what follows is often grief. You mourn not just people or roles, but an entire framework of meaning. The ego, having lost its map, will do anything to reclaim orientation, even if that means pretending the journey is over. It will put on a new mask, one made of spiritual slogans, and say, "I'm already whole. There is nothing more to seek." But this too is a defense. Jung believed that the psyche requires honesty above comfort. And the most honest act in this phase is to admit you are in transition, not enlightened, not broken, simply in process. This is where true transformation begins, not through bypassing pain, but through meeting it face to face with compassion and courage. The danger of skipping this inner work is not just personal, it is collective. A culture that avoids psychological integration becomes performative. We begin to reward appearances over substance. The person who speaks most fluently about love may be the one who fears intimacy. The one who preaches detachment may be running from their own unresolved attachments. Jung warned that the unexamined shadow doesn't disappear through good intentions, it acts out in unconscious patterns. So how do you stay rooted during this vulnerable phase? The first step is to recognize the signs of bypassing. Are you using spiritual ideas to avoid conflict? Are you dismissing your emotions in the name of higher truth? Are you ignoring your needs, your anger, your sadness, believing that they are somehow unspiritual? These are not signs of growth, they are signs of avoidance. Jung would urge you to turn inward, not to escape, but to integrate. This is where the real alchemy happens, not in transcendence, but in transformation. The goal is not to rise above the human experience, but to become more fully human. The unconscious does not ask you to float above life. It asks you to live it more deeply, with presence, with honesty, and with soul. And when you do this work, when you face what you've avoided, you begin to reclaim your psychic energy. What once showed up as apathy now becomes intuition. What once felt like numbness now feels like peace. You begin to feel again, not in chaotic swings, but in steady waves. You no longer need to chase the light because you have made peace with the dark. This is the middle path. Not indulgence, not avoidance, not ego, not escape, but integration. And that is the soul's true desire, not to be perfect, but to be whole. So if you find yourself floating, detached, disconnected, spiritually numb, Ask not what you've lost, but what you've refused to feel. Because the self you are becoming cannot be born until the self you've protected has been fully seen. In Part 4, we will explore how the true self begins to emerge not through force, but through resonance, and how to recognize the quiet return of authentic motivation that no longer burns from fear, but glows from alignment. Once you've passed through the desert of silence, once the false identities have burned away and the bypassing has been exposed, something begins to stir. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. In fact, it might be so subtle you almost miss it. But this is the moment Jung considered sacred, the slow emergence of the self. In analytical psychology, the self is not the ego, nor is it simply the conscious mind. The self is the totality of your being, both conscious and unconscious. It is the organizing center of your psyche, the deeper blueprint of your life. And when the ego surrenders its need to control and impress, the self begins to lead. This emergence doesn't look like motivation in the traditional sense. It does not mimic hustle or urgency. It feels more like alignment, a quiet, inner yes. What's vital to understand here is that the self does not operate on external validation. It doesn't ask, will this succeed? It asks, is this true? And so your decisions begin to shift. You no longer chase what shines on the surface. You are drawn toward what resonates below it. This is not passivity. It is a new form of energy, an internal compass replacing the external checklist. Jung believed that when we begin to live from the self, our actions take on a symbolic quality. He called this living symbolically, not in fantasy or abstraction, but in a state where life itself becomes a conversation between the inner and outer worlds. A dream that won't leave you a strange synchronicity, a recurring image in your imagination. These are not coincidences. They are communications from the unconscious guiding your next steps. In this state, motivation returns, but its source has shifted. No longer fueled by fear of inadequacy or longing for applause, it becomes something quieter and more sustainable. You feel called, not driven. And in Jung's framework, this calling is not a romantic metaphor. It's literal. The self calls the ego to serve a greater wholeness rather than a fragmented desire. This transition often surprises people. You might find yourself drawn to projects, ideas, or relationships that once felt irrelevant. Or you may begin letting go of things that once defined you, even if they still seem successful to others. From the outside, your life may appear to be simplifying, but inwardly, it is deepening. One of Jung's greatest insights was that meaning does not arrive from effort alone, it arises from integration. When your conscious mind and unconscious mind begin to communicate, your life begins to express something larger than personality. This is where art is born. This is where healing begins. This is where teaching, service, and creativity emerge not as performance, but as expression. But this shift requires trust. The self does not speak in commands. It speaks in symbols, intuitions, and resonance. And it often leads you into uncertainty because your ego wants clarity, while the self wants truth. To follow the self is to allow yourself to move toward what feels alive, even if you cannot yet explain it. And here's the paradox. Jung so often spoke of when you stop demanding motivation, it returns. When you stop chasing clarity, you recognize it. This is the wisdom of opposites, what he called enantiodromia, where one extreme leads to its reversal. You swung from egoic striving to soul-level stillness, and now you swing again, this time toward authentic expression. From this place, the ordinary begins to feel extraordinary. You may find joy in simple rituals, writing, walking, building, nurturing, resting, not because they lead to productivity, but because they feel congruent with your being. You say yes without people-pleasing and no without guilt. You act not to impress, but to express. And slowly, a new form of ambition may emerge, not the ambition to dominate, but to embody your truth, to give shape to the inner world you have worked so hard to uncover. This is the self in action, not as a destination, but as a lived reality. So if you felt the return of a quiet pull, a subtle curiosity, even after months of stillness follow it, that is your new compass. That is your new fuel. It may not roar like your old fire, but it will not flicker in the wind. It is steady, silent, and true. And as we move into the conclusion of this journey, we'll reflect on how to continue walking this path not as a performance for the world, but as a devotion to the soul. Because awakening is not the end, it is the invitation, and your becoming has only just begun. If you've stayed with this journey to the end, something in you already knows this isn't about going back. It's about going deeper. What you've been feeling, the loss of motivation, the disorientation after awakening the pull away from everything you once chased, is not a detour. It is the path itself. Carl Jung understood that every transformation of the soul begins with dissolution. The breaking down of old goals, identities, even dreams, is not a sign of collapse. It is the psyche's way of clearing space for something more authentic to emerge, and you are already in motion. You may not see it. You may not feel it every day. But the fact that you're asking new questions, listening more closely, pausing when the world says push, that is evidence of the self at work. You are no longer trying to dominate your life. You are beginning to participate in it. This is the shift Jung called individuation, the sacred process of becoming whole. And wholeness is not the same as perfection. It is not about being motivated all the time. It is about being honest, present, awake, even in the midst of not knowing. You do not need to light a fire beneath you. You only need to uncover the one already burning within you, quiet, steady, and ancient. As you move forward, remember this: not every season will feel clear. Some phases are meant to be cocoon-like, silent, opaque, uncomfortable. But that doesn't mean you're lost. It means you're becoming. And becoming is not a performance. It is a return. A return to the self, to what resonates, to what heals instead of hides, to what grows instead of masks. And when you begin to live from that place, motivation stops being a whip. It becomes a rhythm, a conversation, a dance. If this video spoke to something you've been feeling but couldn't quite name, I invite you to share it in the comments. Your story may help someone else realize they're not alone in this sacred pause. And if you're someone who seeks truth depth and psychological clarity, not just surface-level advice, I encourage you to subscribe to my channel. Here, we explore the inner terrain together, slowly, honestly, with reverence for the mystery that is your unfolding life. Because the awakening is not the finish line, it's where the real story begins.